Now to breaking news in the war between Israel and Hamas.
2 American hostages kidnapped by Hamas terrorists almost 2 weeks ago have just been released today. The 2 Americans, a teenage girl and her mother, and they are relatives of former NBC News foreign correspondent Martin Fletcher. And this just coming into our newsroom right now, you are looking at the very first photo of that moment. Those 2 American hostages walked out free with the Israeli Defense Forces as we see them there holding the hands of somebody from the Israeli military. And we have team coverage tonight with another rally that's getting underway right now in Manhattan, in Midtown Manhattan. But let's start now with News 4's Melissa Russo on this major breakthrough in the war. Melissa.
Yeah, you know, for one family, there's this immense relief, as you can imagine. A mother and daughter, Americans from Illinois, captured by Hamas at a kibbutz during a family visit 13 days ago. They were released by Hamas today. Positive news, no doubt, but against a backdrop of 200 other hostages whose fate is unknown.
They were visiting their grandmother on the kibbutz. It was her 85th birthday.
NBC's former Mideast correspondent Martin Fletcher cautiously elated at the news that his American family members, Judith and Natalie Raanan, are free.
What a miracle for one family, and many more families waiting for similar miracles. I don't want to emphasize how happy we are before it happens, because I know so many other people are still suffering bitterly.
The reaction from relatives to the Raanan's rabbi in the Midwest.
We continue to ask for your prayers.
To the State Department, a mix of relief and reservation.
We share in the relief that their families, friends, and loved ones are feeling. But there are still 10 additional Americans who remain unaccounted for in this conflict. We know that some of them are being held hostage by Hamas, along with an estimated 200 other hostages.
After the release, Secretary of State Antony Blinken demanded all hostages be released, declining to discuss U.S. strategy, but thanking the Arab nation Qatar for its help.
Erev tov v'Shabbat shalom.
The Israeli Defense Force today announcing that Hamas had presented the release as a humanitarian gesture, but warned that in reality, Hamas is a murderous terrorist organization. The move complicates Israel's position, especially if it builds international goodwill for Hamas. But questions remain. How many of these hostages are still alive, and will Hamas try to use them to ward off the impending ground war in Gaza?
Once Israel invades Gaza with 100 or 200,000 soldiers, there's going to be no room for a prisoner swap.
And keep in mind that it's no coincidence that the hostages released today were American. We had that look at the very first photograph released by the IDF today, post-release. People desperate to know more about their condition. But, you know, some believe that this move by Hamas could be an attempt to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Israel, because Israel is, of course, getting ready to invade Gaza, and the U.S. and President Biden say the top priority for them is to secure the release of hostages. And there are still 10 more hostages who are American. And that being said, Secretary Blinken did repeat today that Israel has a right and an obligation to defend itself. Gilma?
Thank you, Melissa. And meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza gets more dire by the hour, supplies running low. As airstrikes continue, the Hamas-run health ministry saying more than 4,100 people have been killed in Gaza, most of them civilians. Meanwhile, more than 1,400 people have been killed in Israel since the terror attacks on October 7th. News 4's Chris Jose picks up our team coverage from Midtown, where a rally calling for a ceasefire in the Middle East is getting underway. Chris, what are you seeing there?
Hey, Gilma, despite the rain that we're seeing here this afternoon, we are expecting hundreds of people to show up here for a rally in support of Palestine tonight. Demonstrators urging Congress to call for an immediate ceasefire. The group telling us that's the only way to prevent more killings, bring hostages home, and deliver humanitarian aid. Just over across Fifth Avenue, you can see back there the crowd just starting to show up. So you can see here the crowd getting larger by the minute now. Demonstrators, including a New York Assembly member, reacting to President Biden's pledge to ask Congress for billions of dollars in military assistance.
For all of the nice words that President Biden had to say yesterday, none of them included the word ceasefire. And if you're not calling for a ceasefire, what you're calling for is a genocide, because that's what we're seeing unfold in this moment. And we're not observers, we're actors. We're actors because as Americans, we send $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel every year. And since the horrific attacks and killings of Israeli civilians last Saturday, 2 Saturdays ago rather, we are now seeing the manufacturing of consent across this country to support a war that will only kill more civilians.
Now, people in support of Israel have been telling us that airstrikes are the only way to eliminate Hamas. Palestinian supporters here are calling that act inhumane. We're live in Midtown. Chris Jose, News 4 New York.
Thank you, Chris. And be sure to stay with News 4 on air and online for continuing coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. We're going to bring you updates on the hostages, the humanitarian crisis, and the response here in the tri-state.